Before a Thracian king unified the interior of southeastern Europe, the land itself defined the limits of power. Between roughly 1200 and 500 BCE, the region known to Greek authors as Thrace extended from the lower Danube in the north to the Aegean Sea in the south, and from the Black Sea coast to the valleys bordering Macedonia. This terrain, mountainous, forested, and intersected by major river systems, shaped settlement patterns long before political consolidation emerged. The Balkan mountain range, referred to in antiquity as the Hemus, formed a natural spine across the region. To its south lay the Rhodope Mountains, a rugged massif with limited agricultural capacity but strong defensive advantages. Between these uplands stretched fertile plains watered by the Hebrus River, modern Maritsa, which flowed southeast into the Aegean. Records indicate that this river corridor later became central to political integration because it allowed communication and movement between inland settlements and coastal trade networks. Archaeological surveys conducted across southern Bulgaria and northeastern Greece demonstrate continuous habitation from the late Bronze Age. Excavations of fortified hill settlements reveal defensive earthworks and stone ramparts dating to the early Iron Age. These sites suggest communities organized around elevated strongholds, a pattern consistent with societies prioritizing localized security rather than centralized authority. The dispersion of such fortified centers indicates a fragmented political landscape. Burial practices provide further insight into social structure. Throughout Thrace, tumulus graves, earthen mounds covering elite burials, contain weapons, horse gear, bronze vessels, and imported ceramics. Archaeologists uncovered richly furnished tombs near Kazanlak, including wall paintings and ceremonial objects dated to later centuries but rooted in earlier traditions. These findings confirm the existence of a warrior aristocracy by the early Iron Age. Grave goods vary significantly in scale, demonstrating hierarchical differentiation within tribal societies. Material culture also reflects external contact. Greek pottery fragments from the 7th and 6th centuries BCE appear in inland Thracian contexts, particularly near coastal colonies such as Apollonia Pontica and Maroneia. According to classical sources, these colonies facilitated exchange in grain, timber, metals, and livestock. The presence of imported goods in elite graves suggests that long-distance trade reinforced status distinctions. However, no evidence from this period indicates the presence of a centralized Thracian administration overseeing such exchanges. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Thracians as numerous and divided into many tribes. While his account reflects Greek ethnographic interpretation, it aligns with archaeological evidence of decentralized settlement clusters. He notes that, if unified, the Thracians would be formidable, yet they remained politically segmented. This observation corresponds with the absence of large urban centers comparable to Greek polis during the period under examination. Geography reinforced this fragmentation. Mountain barriers limited sustained communication between valleys. Dense forests restricted rapid troop movement. River plains supported agriculture but did not automatically produce urbanization. As a result, authority tended to concentrate at the tribal level rather than extend across the entire region. Political organization remained embedded in kinship networks and localized leadership. Evidence from metal production supports the importance of resource distribution. Thrace possessed deposits of gold and silver, particularly in the Rhodope region. Archaeometallurgical analysis indicates active extraction during the early Iron Age. Control over mineral resources likely strengthened elite authority within specific territories. However, mining operations appear localized rather than coordinated across the broader region. This geographic configuration produced a distinctive pattern: strong local elites operating within environmentally defined zones. The combination of defensible highlands, fertile river plains, and access to maritime trade created conditions favorable for wealth accumulation but unfavorable for immediate political unity. Interpretive analysis suggests that state formation in Thrace required mechanisms capable of bridging these natural divisions. By the 6th century BCE, increasing interaction with the Aegean world introduced new political and economic pressures. Greek literacy, coinage, and diplomatic practice became visible in coastal exchanges. While inland communities retained tribal structures, external contact gradually altered regional dynamics. As tribal societies adapted to trade, resource competition, and shifting alliances, leadership structures began to move beyond purely local authority. Before continuing deeper into the historical narrative, viewers are encouraged to subscribe to the channel to follow the full development of the Odrysian Kingdom and related civilizations. Enabling notifications ensures access to upcoming documentary releases, and comments highlighting specific sections or insights contribute to ongoing discussion and scholarly engagement within the community. By the 6th century BCE, Thrace was not a kingdom, but it was no longer politically static. Across the river valleys and upland plains of southeastern Europe, tribal communities were reorganizing in response to demographic growth, resource competition, and expanding contact with the Aegean world. Between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, political authority in Thrace evolved beyond isolated clan leadership toward broader regional confederations. Ancient sources identify several major Thracian tribes during this period, including the Odrysians, Bessi, Gedi, and Triballi. These groups were not unified under a single ruler, but they were not entirely isolated from one another. Archaeological patterns reveal clusters of settlements sharing similar burial practices, weapon types, and ceramic traditions. Such similarities suggest networks of alliance or shared cultural frameworks, even in the absence of centralized governance. Political authority rested primarily with aristocratic lineages. Elite status was reinforced through control of land, herds, and access to trade routes. Tumulus burials from the early Iron Age demonstrate clear stratification. Archaeologists uncovered graves containing iron swords, spearheads, horse trappings, and gold ornaments alongside more modest interments lacking such goods. The concentration of wealth within specific burial sites indicates hereditary leadership and a warrior-based social hierarchy. Records indicate that control of mobility, particularly cavalry, became a defining marker of elite authority. Horse equipment found in burial mounds suggests that mounted warfare played a central role in sustaining aristocratic dominance. This military capacity allowed leading families to impose tribute within localized territories. However, there is no evidence of standardized taxation or bureaucratic oversight across tribal regions. Greek colonization along the northern Aegean coast during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE introduced new political and economic dynamics. Colonies such as Apollonia Pontica and Maroneia established trading relationships with inland Thracian communities. Greek ceramics, amphory, and metal goods appear in archaeological contexts far from the coast, demonstrating sustained exchange networks. In return, Thrace supplied timber, grain, livestock, and precious metals. The introduction of coinage in the Aegean world had indirect effects on Thracian elites. While early Thracian societies did not immediately adopt minted currency, hordes of Greek coins found in inland contexts indicate exposure to monetized exchange. Access to trade revenues strengthened aristocratic households and expanded their diplomatic leverage. This development encouraged broader alliances among tribes seeking to regulate commerce and secure trade corridors. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, observed that the Thracians were among the most numerous peoples known to the Greeks. He further noted that their division into many tribes prevented them from achieving unified power. While his account reflects external perception, it aligns with material evidence of decentralized authority. No archaeological findings from the 8th to 6th centuries BCE indicate the presence of a royal capital, standardized law codes, or permanent administrative centers. Yet fragmentation did not equate to political stagnation. Burial patterns reveal increasingly elaborate ceremonial displays during the 6th century BCE, suggesting competitive elite signaling. Larger mounds, more intricate grave goods, and imported luxury items indicate intensifying rivalry among aristocratic houses. This competition likely encouraged temporary confederations formed for warfare or trade protection. Interpretive analysis suggests that these tribal confederations functioned as flexible political coalitions. Authority was negotiated rather than imposed. Leadership may have depended on personal charisma, martial success, and redistribution of spoils. Such systems were capable of rapid mobilization but lacked institutional permanence. This structure explains both the military capability noted by Greek authors and the absence of sustained regional unity. Geography continued to shape these political arrangements. River valleys, such as that of the Hebrus, facilitated seasonal assemblies and exchange. Mountain barriers, however, restricted continuous oversight. As a result, confederations likely formed along ecological corridors rather than across the entire Thracian landscape. Control over key passes and river crossings became increasingly significant. By the late 6th century BCE, Thrace occupied a strategic position between the expanding Greek world and the rising Achaemenid Empire. Trade flows increased, and regional leaders accumulated wealth at unprecedented levels. The growing scale of elite resources created incentives for broader political coordination. Larger confederations could secure tribute more effectively and defend against external incursions. This transition from isolated tribal leadership to proto-state formations did not immediately produce monarchy. Instead, it generated a competitive environment in which dominant tribes could extend influence over neighboring groups. Among these, the Odrysians emerged as particularly well-positioned due to their location in the fertile Hebrus Valley and proximity to major trade routes. In the mid-5th century BCE, one Thracian leader succeeded where others had not. He united the tribes. Around 470 to 445 BCE, a ruler identified in Greek sources as Teres I established what historians recognize as the first durable Thracian kingdom. His consolidation of authority did not erase tribal structures, but it reoriented them under a dominant dynasty centered in the Hebrus Valley. The principal literary evidence for Teres comes from Thucydides, writing later in the 5th century BCE. In his account of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides refers to Teres as the founder of the Odrysian royal house and notes the extent of the kingdom later inherited by his son, Sitalces. While Thucydides does not provide a detailed biography, his testimony confirms that by the late 5th century BCE the Odrysian dynasty was recognized as a major political force in southeastern Europe. Archaeological evidence complements this literary record. Excavations across central and southern Bulgaria reveal increasingly elaborate elite burials dating to the later 5th century BCE, suggesting consolidation of wealth and authority. The distribution of prestige goods becomes more geographically concentrated, particularly along the Hebrus River corridor. This pattern indicates the emergence of a political center capable of redistributing resources and asserting dominance over surrounding territories. Records indicate that Teres expanded Odrysian influence through tributary arrangements rather than direct annexation. Neighboring tribes retained their own leaders but acknowledged the supremacy of the Odrysian king. Tribute likely consisted of silver, agricultural produce, livestock, and military support. Thucydides later describes the Odrysian kingdom as deriving substantial revenue from subject populations, implying that this system was already established under Teres. This model of governance represented a structural innovation within Thrace. Earlier tribal confederations had depended on temporary alliances. Teres' authority appears to have been continuous and hereditary. Interpretive analysis suggests that the durability of his rule rested on two factors: control of strategic geography and the ability to mediate between competing aristocratic houses. By positioning the Odrysian center along the fertile Hebrus plain, Teres secured access to agricultural surplus and inland trade routes. External conditions also contributed to Teres' success. During the early 5th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire had exerted influence in parts of Thrace, particularly following the campaigns of Darius I. However, Persian control receded after the Greco-Persian Wars. The resulting power vacuum reduced external interference and allowed ambitious local leaders to consolidate authority. Teres' rise coincided with this period of shifting imperial boundaries. Interaction with the Greek world further shaped Odrysian consolidation. Greek colonies along the Aegean coast maintained commercial relationships with inland Thrace. Diplomatic exchanges likely accompanied trade, introducing formalized treaty practices and political negotiation. Although no surviving Odrysian inscriptions from Teres' reign have been definitively identified, later Greek accounts imply structured diplomatic engagement between Thracian rulers and Greek states. The scale of Teres' expansion can be inferred indirectly. Thucydides describes the Odrysian kingdom at its height as stretching from the Abdera region near the Aegean to the Danube River in the north. While this description primarily reflects the reign of Sitalces, such expansion presupposes earlier consolidation under Teres. It is unlikely that Sitalces could have mobilized a large multi-tribal force without an established tributary framework inherited from his predecessor. Military capacity played a central role in this consolidation. Thracian forces were known for their light infantry and cavalry, particularly peltasts equipped with javelins and small shields. By coordinating tribal levies under a unified command, Teres could project power across regions previously limited to localized warfare. However, evidence suggests that this army remained a coalition force rather than a permanent standing army. Interpretive insight indicates that Teres' achievement was less about imposing centralized bureaucracy and more about stabilizing hierarchy among elites. The Odrysian king acted as primus inter pares, first among equals, within a network of powerful regional leaders. This arrangement reduced intertribal conflict by institutionalizing supremacy while preserving local autonomy. Such a structure was adaptable to Thrace's mountainous geography and dispersed settlement patterns. The absence of a fixed monumental capital during Teres' reign further illustrates the transitional nature of this state. Unlike Greek polis or Near Eastern monarchies, the early Odrysian court appears to have been itinerant. Royal authority traveled along river valleys and assembly sites, reinforcing loyalty through personal presence. Archaeological evidence for later urban centers such as Southopolis dates to the 4th century BCE, suggesting that permanent administrative infrastructure developed gradually. Economic factors also reinforced political consolidation. Control of mineral resources in the Rhodope region and agricultural surplus from river plains enabled redistribution to loyal elites. Tribute strengthened the central dynasty's capacity to reward allies and maintain stability. Records from later periods describe annual revenues that rivaled significant Greek states, indicating that the tributary system became increasingly structured over time. By the time Teres' reign concluded, the Odrysian polity had achieved recognition as a coherent kingdom. It remained a layered system of subordinate rulers rather than a fully centralized monarchy, yet it represented a decisive shift from tribal confederation to dynastic authority. The integration of geography, military coordination, and tribute networks laid the institutional foundations for further expansion. During the Peloponnesian War, Thrace was no longer peripheral, it was a decisive regional power. Under the rule of Sitalces, who reigned approximately from 431 to 424 BCE, the Odrysian Kingdom reached the height of its territorial influence and entered directly into the geopolitical conflicts of the Greek world. Literary evidence, particularly from Thucydides, provides detailed testimony regarding the scale of Odrysian authority during this period. Sitalces inherited the political framework established by Teres I but expanded it significantly. According to Thucydides, the Odrysian kingdom under Sitalces extended from the Abdera region along the northern Aegean coast to the Danube River in the north, and inland toward the lands bordering Macedonia and the Triballi. This expanse made it the largest organized political entity in southeastern Europe outside the Greek polis. The scale of this dominion rested not on centralized administration but on a reinforced system of tributary subordination. Records indicate that Sitalces strengthened the tributary structure by formalizing obligations from subordinate tribes. Thucydides estimates that annual revenues reached substantial sums in silver and kind, though modern scholars debate the exact figures. Nonetheless, the description confirms that tribute collection became systematic and predictable. This regularization of revenue enhanced the monarchy's capacity to fund campaigns, reward loyal elites, and sustain diplomatic initiatives. Diplomacy was central to Sitalces' strategy. In 431 BCE, at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Athens sought alliances beyond mainland Greece to counter Spartan influence. Thucydides records that Sitalces entered into an alliance with Athens, facilitated in part through dynastic marriage connections and mutual strategic interests. The Athenians recognized the Odrysian king as a significant northern partner capable of exerting pressure on Macedonia and securing access to timber and grain supplies. This alliance illustrates the integration of the Odrysian kingdom into the interstate system of the eastern Mediterranean. Sitalces did not merely participate as a tribal war leader. He negotiated as a monarch representing a recognized political entity. Interpretive analysis suggests that this diplomatic engagement elevated the status of the Odrysian court and reinforced its authority internally. By securing alliances with major Greek powers, Sitalces demonstrated his capacity to act on a regional scale. The most prominent demonstration of Odrysian military power occurred in 429 BCE, when Sitalces launched a large-scale campaign into Macedonia. Thucydides provides a detailed account of this expedition, estimating the force at tens of thousands, composed of Thracian tribal contingents and allied units. The campaign aimed to support Athenian interests and to assert Odrysian influence over Macedonian succession disputes. Archaeological evidence for this campaign is limited, but the literary record underscores its scale. The mobilization of such a force indicates effective coordination among subordinate tribes. It also reflects the capacity of the Odrysian king to summon levies across diverse regions. This achievement demonstrates the maturity of the tributary and alliance system constructed under Teres and expanded by Sitalces. However, the Macedonian campaign also exposed structural weaknesses. Thucydides reports that the army faced supply shortages and logistical strain during winter operations. Thracian forces, accustomed to seasonal warfare, struggled to maintain cohesion over extended distances. The decentralized nature of the kingdom meant that loyalty was conditional. Prolonged campaigns risked weakening internal stability. Interpretive insight suggests that Sitalces' expansion revealed the limits of federated monarchy. While the Odrysian state could mobilize rapidly and project force, it lacked permanent logistical infrastructure comparable to that of larger empires. There is no evidence of established supply depots, standardized provisioning systems, or permanent garrisons across distant territories. Military success therefore depended on short campaigns and negotiated settlements rather than sustained occupation. Diplomatic marriages reinforced political cohesion during this period. Ancient sources note alliances forged through familial ties, linking the Odrysian royal house to neighboring elites. Such marriages strengthened tributary relationships and reduced the likelihood of rebellion. This practice reflects a broader pattern of elite integration common in early monarchies lacking bureaucratic enforcement mechanisms. Sitalces' reign also demonstrates the interplay between internal authority and external recognition. Athenian envoys and Greek chroniclers treated the Odrysian king as a sovereign ruler, acknowledging his capacity to influence regional affairs. This external validation likely reinforced internal legitimacy among Thracian elites. Interpretive analysis indicates that international diplomacy functioned as a mechanism of domestic consolidation. Despite these achievements, the campaign against Macedonia did not result in permanent territorial annexation. Thucydides records that Sitalces eventually withdrew after facing resistance and logistical constraints. The expedition achieved limited strategic gains but did not fundamentally alter the balance of power in Macedonia. This outcome illustrates the constraints inherent in the Odrysian political structure. Sitalces' death in 424 BCE marked a turning point. Although his reign elevated the kingdom to unprecedented prominence, the continuity of centralized authority depended on effective succession. The absence of a rigid hereditary framework increased the risk of fragmentation. As in earlier Thracian traditions, authority remained tied to personal leadership rather than institutional permanence. By the conclusion of Sitalces' reign, the Odrysian kingdom had established itself as a recognized regional power integrated into the diplomatic and military networks of the Greek world. Tribute revenues were systematized, alliances formalized, and military coordination expanded. Yet the same decentralized framework that enabled rapid mobilization also limited long-term cohesion. The Odrysian state ruled vast territory without governing it directly. From the mid-5th century BCE onward, the Odrysian kingdom operated as a federated monarchy whose cohesion depended on tribute, military obligation, and personal allegiance rather than centralized bureaucracy. Literary testimony, especially from Thucydides, provides the clearest contemporary description of this system during the reigns of Sitalces and his successors. Thucydides records that the Odrysian king derived significant annual revenues from subject territories. These revenues consisted of payments in silver and gold, livestock, agricultural produce, and manufactured goods. While precise figures remain debated among modern historians, the historian explicitly states that the income surpassed that of many Greek city-states. This statement suggests a structured and recurring tributary framework rather than occasional plunder. Tribute was collected from subordinate tribal rulers who retained authority within their own territories. Archaeological patterns indicate continuity of local elite burial practices across regions under Odrysian supremacy. The persistence of distinct regional material culture implies that local governance remained intact. The king did not replace tribal leaders with appointed administrators. Instead, he imposed overarching supremacy while permitting local autonomy. This arrangement required regular acknowledgement of royal authority. Payments were likely delivered during assemblies or seasonal gatherings along major river corridors such as the Hebrus. The river system facilitated movement and communication across dispersed territories. Control of these corridors allowed the king to supervise tribute flows without maintaining permanent garrisons in each region. Military service formed another essential component of Odrysian authority. Subordinate dynasts were obligated to provide troops upon royal summons. Thucydides describes large Thracian forces mobilized during campaigns, including cavalry and light infantry units. These forces were not permanent standing armies but tribal levies coordinated under central leadership. Their effectiveness depended on the willingness of local elites to fulfill their obligations. The absence of standardized coinage across the entire kingdom during the 5th century BCE further illustrates the decentralized structure. While Greek coinage circulated widely in Thrace due to trade, there is limited evidence for uniform Odrysian minting before the 4th century BCE. Economic integration therefore rested more on tribute redistribution than on monetary unification. Royal authority was personal and itinerant. Unlike the urbanized centers of Greek polis, the Odrysian court did not initially operate from a fixed monumental capital. Archaeologists have identified Southopolis as a later urban foundation dating to the 4th century BCE, but during the earlier period the royal household appears to have moved between strategic locations. This mobility enabled direct interaction with subordinate rulers and reinforced loyalty through presence. Diplomatic marriages contributed to the stability of this federated system. Greek sources refer to intermarriage between Odrysian royalty and neighboring elites. Such alliances strengthened bonds between dynastic houses and reduced the likelihood of rebellion. Marriage functioned as a political instrument compensating for the absence of bureaucratic oversight. Records from Greek authors also indicate that some subordinate rulers negotiated independently with external powers, including Athens and Macedonia. These instances demonstrate the layered nature of Odrysian sovereignty. While the king held overarching authority, subordinate dynasts maintained localized agency. This complexity occasionally produced overlapping allegiances and competing diplomatic initiatives. The geographic configuration of Thrace shaped this political model. Mountain ranges and forested terrain limited direct surveillance over distant territories. River valleys created natural zones of interaction but did not eliminate regional separation. The federated monarchy adapted to these conditions by prioritizing tribute recognition over territorial uniformity. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of centralized wealth accumulation at certain nodal points. Elite burial assemblages from central Thrace reveal concentrations of imported Greek vessels, precious metals, and finely crafted weapons. These concentrations indicate redistribution from tributary regions to the royal center. However, similar elite burials persist in peripheral areas, confirming that wealth was not monopolized exclusively by the monarchy. The durability of Odrysian kingship depended on continued military credibility. A king unable to enforce tribute risked losing allegiance. Greek sources describe episodes of rivalry among claimants to the throne, illustrating the conditional nature of loyalty within the federated structure. Authority rested less on institutional permanence than on sustained leadership capacity. There is no evidence from the 5th century BCE of codified legal systems or standardized administrative divisions imposed across the entire kingdom. Governance operated through negotiated hierarchy rather than formal bureaucracy. Tribute and military obligation constituted the primary instruments of cohesion. The Odrysian model contrasts with contemporary centralized empires such as the Achaemenid Empire, where satrapal administration and written record-keeping structured governance. In Thrace, authority functioned through interpersonal networks and recurring tribute exchanges. Greek observers recognized the scale of Odrysian power but did not describe administrative uniformity comparable to Near Eastern systems. By the later 5th century BCE, this federated monarchy had stabilized sufficiently to sustain large-scale campaigns and diplomatic alliances. Tribute revenues funded royal initiatives, while subordinate rulers maintained day-to-day governance within their territories. The kingdom's political structure thus combined centralized supremacy with localized autonomy. Royal power expanded quickly, but stability did not follow. The Odrysian Kingdom achieved rapid territorial growth under Teres I and Sitalces, yet its political framework lacked a formalized law of succession. Authority was hereditary in principle, but not regulated by codified rules of primogeniture. As a result, transitions of power frequently generated rivalry among royal heirs and regional dynasts. The death of Sitalces in 424 BCE marked the first major succession crisis recorded in Greek sources. Thucydides notes that Sitalces was succeeded by his nephew Southe's I rather than by a direct son. This transition suggests that legitimacy depended on consensus within the royal house and support among subordinate elites. The choice of successor likely reflected internal negotiation rather than automatic inheritance. Southe's I inherited an expansive but structurally fragile kingdom. Tribute networks required constant enforcement, and loyalty from subordinate rulers could not be assumed. During his reign, Odrysian authority appears to have contracted in some peripheral areas. While Greek literary sources provide limited detail, archaeological distribution of elite material culture indicates uneven political cohesion during the later 5th century BCE. By the early 4th century BCE, internal fragmentation became more pronounced. Greek inscriptions and historical accounts refer to multiple Odrysian rulers operating simultaneously in different regions. Ammaticus I, for example, is documented as ruling in eastern Thrace, while Southe's II held authority in central territories. Xenophon, in his Anabasis, describes interactions with Southe's II during the retreat of the 10,000 around 400 BCE. His account portrays Southe's as a regional dynast negotiating independently with Greek mercenaries. These concurrent reigns indicate that the Odrysian kingdom functioned less as a unified monarchy and more as a constellation of competing royal branches. Sub-kings retained substantial autonomy, especially in distant territories. Without a standardized mechanism to resolve succession disputes, rival claimants mobilized personal alliances to secure recognition. Military backing and access to tribute resources became decisive factors in these contests. Greek diplomatic records confirm the existence of parallel negotiations. Athens and Macedonia at times concluded agreements with different Odrysian rulers depending on strategic convenience. Such arrangements reveal the decentralized character of authority. External powers exploited internal divisions to advance their own interests, reinforcing fragmentation within Thrace. Coinage evidence from the 4th century BCE further illustrates political multiplicity. Several Odrysian rulers issued coins bearing their own names and iconography. The circulation of distinct royal coinage in overlapping territories suggests segmented sovereignty rather than centralized fiscal control. Monetary production reflected individual dynastic legitimacy rather than unified state identity. Military coordination suffered under these conditions. While earlier rulers had mobilized large tribal levies for expansive campaigns, later kings struggled to assemble cohesive forces. Xenophon's narrative describes Southe's II seeking mercenary support to reinforce his position against rivals. Reliance on external troops indicates limited confidence in unified tribal backing. Geography contributed to the persistence of fragmentation. Mountain ranges and river valleys created natural regional strongholds where local rulers could consolidate power independently. Communication between eastern and western Thrace required negotiation across difficult terrain. In the absence of permanent administrative centers capable of enforcing succession outcomes, territorial division remained feasible. The assassination of Cotys I in 359 BCE further demonstrates the volatility of dynastic politics. Classical sources, including Demosthenes, reference Cotys' reign as a period of renewed consolidation, followed by renewed fragmentation after his death. His sons divided the kingdom into separate domains, each seeking recognition and alliances with neighboring powers. This division weakened resistance to external intervention, particularly from Macedonia. Legal codification of succession is not attested in surviving sources. There is no evidence of written constitutional principles governing inheritance within the Odrysian royal house. Authority appears to have derived from lineage claims combined with elite endorsement. This system enabled flexibility but also generated repeated instability. Treaties preserved in Greek inscriptions reveal fluctuating territorial control. Agreements between Odrysian rulers and Athenian representatives often reference specific cities or regions rather than a single unified kingdom. Such documentation indicates that diplomatic recognition depended on practical authority over defined areas rather than symbolic claims to overarching rule. Archaeologists have identified shifts in burial patterns corresponding to periods of division. Regional elite tombs display distinct stylistic variations during the 4th century BCE, reflecting localized centers of power. These material distinctions support literary evidence of political segmentation. The cumulative effect of dynastic rivalry was inconsistent governance. Tribute collection became irregular in contested regions. Military campaigns were limited in scope, often directed against rival claimants rather than external threats. Subordinate tribes could leverage these divisions to renegotiate obligations or assert greater autonomy. By the mid-4th century BCE, the Odrysian Kingdom remained territorially extensive but politically fragmented. Multiple rulers operated simultaneously, issuing coinage, conducting diplomacy, and mobilizing forces within overlapping spheres of influence. External observers, including Macedonian strategists, recognized the strategic implications of this division. Power in Thrace was reinforced not only by force, but by belief. Within the Odrysian Kingdom, political authority operated in parallel with religious tradition, and royal legitimacy drew upon established ritual systems that predated state formation. Archaeological discoveries and classical testimony together reveal a religious landscape centered on hero cults, ancestor veneration, and chthonic deities associated with the earth and the afterlife. Evidence for Thracian religious practice derives primarily from burial contexts. Across central and southern Thrace, archaeologists have uncovered tumulus tombs dating from the late Bronze Age through the Classical period. These structures vary in scale but frequently contain weapons, armor, horse harnesses, drinking vessels, and imported luxury goods. The inclusion of martial equipment in elite graves indicates the symbolic association between warrior status and posthumous identity. Excavations near Kazanlak, although later in date, preserve mural paintings depicting banqueting scenes and equestrian imagery. These iconographic patterns are consistent with earlier traditions inferred from grave goods. The recurring motif of mounted elites suggests that the afterlife was conceptualized as a continuation of aristocratic existence. Horse sacrifices discovered in several tumulus burials reinforce this interpretation. Osteological analysis confirms deliberate interment of horses alongside elite individuals, indicating ritual significance rather than incidental deposition. Such practices imply belief in a stratified afterlife. Grave wealth differs markedly between elite and non-elite burials. The scale of construction and the quality of artifacts indicate that only high-status individuals received elaborate funerary treatment. This differentiation reflects a religious system integrated with social hierarchy. The aristocratic warrior was not only politically dominant in life but ritually distinguished in death. Classical authors provide additional, though external, perspectives. Herodotus references Thracian customs surrounding death, including practices of lamentation and ritual observance. Later writers, including Plato and Strabo, associate Thracian regions with ecstatic cult traditions. While these accounts reflect Greek interpretation and may emphasize exotic elements, they confirm the visibility of Thracian religious identity in the broader Mediterranean context. The cult of Dionysus is frequently linked to Thrace in Greek literature. Euripides situates the origins of Dionysian worship in Thracian territory, and Herodotus associates certain Thracian tribes with Dionysian rites. Archaeological evidence does not always permit direct identification of specific deities, but ritual vessels and symbolic imagery suggest ceremonial drinking practices consistent with ecstatic cult behavior. Greek descriptions likely reflect both indigenous traditions and interpretive adaptation. Orphic traditions also bear Thracian associations. Ancient writers sometimes identify Orpheus as a Thracian figure connected with mystical teachings concerning the soul and the afterlife. While direct evidence for organized Orpheism within early Odrysian society remains limited, funerary inscriptions and symbolic motifs found in later periods indicate evolving theological concepts about purification and immortality. These developments appear intertwined with cultural exchange between Thrace and the Greek world. Religious authority intersected directly with kingship. The Odrysian ruler functioned not only as military commander and tribute collector but also as ritual leader. Royal burials are distinguished by scale and complexity, suggesting ceremonial roles that exceeded ordinary aristocratic status. The king's participation in sacrifice and feasting likely reinforced his position as intermediary between the divine and the community. Archaeological findings from Suthopolis, founded later in the 4th century BCE, reveal urban planning that incorporated sanctuaries within the civic center. Although this urban phase postdates the early consolidation of the kingdom, it demonstrates continuity between royal authority and religious space. Temples and ritual precincts positioned near administrative structures reflect integration of governance and cult practice. Chthonic elements are evident in burial construction techniques. Many tombs were built partially underground, accessed through long corridors known as dromoi. The architectural emphasis on descent suggests symbolic association with the underworld. Grave goods frequently include vessels suitable for libations, implying ongoing ritual communication between the living and the dead. Animal sacrifice played a significant role in ceremonial life. Faunal remains uncovered in burial mounds include horses, cattle, and sheep. Cut marks on bones indicate ritual slaughter. The selection of animals, particularly horses, underscores the connection between elite identity and mounted warfare. Sacrificial display likely reinforced aristocratic prestige within communal gatherings. Religious festivals may have functioned as occasions for political negotiation. Although direct documentation is limited, comparative analysis with neighboring societies suggests that seasonal rituals created opportunities for assemblies and tribute acknowledgement. The convergence of religious ceremony and political obligation would have strengthened the symbolic authority of the monarchy. Material evidence also demonstrates continuity between pre-state tribal religion and Odrysian royal ideology. Burial traditions that predate the 5th century BCE persist into the period of dynastic consolidation. This continuity indicates that the monarchy did not replace indigenous belief systems but incorporated them. Royal legitimacy was framed within established cosmological structures rather than imposed through external religious reform. Greek artistic influence gradually shaped elite religious expression. Imported ceramics depicting mythological scenes appear in Thracian tombs during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Such objects may have introduced new iconography, yet local motifs remained prominent. The coexistence of Greek and Thracian elements reflects cultural interaction without complete assimilation. By the height of Odrysian power, religious symbolism had become inseparable from political authority. Elite burial display, ritual sacrifice, and dynastic mediation reinforced hierarchical order. Belief systems provided continuity across periods of political instability, anchoring royal claims within shared tradition. Greek culture entered Thrace, but it did not replace it. From the 5th century BCE onward, interaction between the Odrysian Kingdom and the Greek world intensified in both scale and complexity. Coastal colonies along the Aegean and Black Sea littorals had long connected Thrace to Mediterranean trade networks. However, during the consolidation of Odrysian power, these interactions evolved beyond commerce. Diplomatic exchanges, military alliances, tribute arrangements, and intermarriage facilitated sustained cultural contact. The result was not cultural erasure but adaptation, a hybrid elite culture combining Thracian traditions with Greek forms. The reign of Sitalces illustrates this dynamic. Greek historical sources describe him engaging diplomatically with Athens during the Peloponnesian War. According to Thucydides, Sitalces entered into alliance agreements that formalized political ties between the Odrysian court and the Athenian state. These arrangements required negotiation in a shared diplomatic language, Greek, and familiarity with Hellenic political customs. The alliance did not subordinate Thrace to Athens. Rather, it positioned the Odrysian monarchy as a recognized participant within a wider interstate system. Material culture confirms this interaction. Greek pottery, especially fine-painted wares from Attic workshops, appears in Thracian elite burials beginning in the late 6th and 5th centuries BCE. These imported vessels were not utilitarian objects but prestige goods. Their presence in funerary contexts indicates symbolic value tied to elite status and participation in Mediterranean exchange networks. Yet these artifacts were integrated into Thracian ritual settings, placed alongside indigenous weapons, horse gear, and locally produced ceramics. Greek objects functioned within Thracian frameworks rather than replacing them. Literacy provides further evidence of selective adaptation. Inscriptions associated with the Odrysian court were increasingly written in the Greek alphabet. Coins minted by Odrysian rulers carried Greek legends, identifying kings by name in a form legible to external trading partners. This adoption of Greek script was practical. Greek served as a lingua franca in commercial and diplomatic contexts across the northern Aegean. Using Greek inscriptions facilitated trade and communication without requiring the abandonment of local spoken languages. Coinage represents a particularly significant development. The issuance of royal coinage under rulers such as Thrace III reflects the convergence of Thracian authority and Hellenic economic models. Coins bore portraits modeled on Greek stylistic conventions and incorporated iconography familiar to Mediterranean audiences. At the same time, symbols referencing local power structures and regional identity remained present. Coinage functioned as both economic instrument and political statement. It asserted sovereignty while signaling integration into established monetary systems. Urban planning in the later Odrysian period demonstrates even deeper cultural synthesis. The city of Sitalces, founded in the 4th century BCE, exhibits characteristics associated with Greek urbanism. Orthogonal street grids, centralized agoras, and fortified walls correspond to Hellenic architectural norms. Yet the city was not a Greek colony. It served as a royal capital embedded within Thracian territory. Its design reflects deliberate appropriation of Greek urban models to enhance administrative efficiency and symbolic prestige. Court practices also reveal adaptation. Greek artistic motifs appear in jewelry, metalwork, and decorative reliefs associated with the Odrysian elite. Banqueting scenes depicted in tomb paintings echo symbolic traditions central to Greek aristocratic culture. Participation in such practices would have reinforced diplomatic bonds with Greek states while signaling sophistication and cosmopolitan identity. However, the Thracian emphasis on equestrian symbolism and martial display persisted. Mounted imagery and warrior iconography remained central to elite representation. It is essential to avoid interpreting these developments as evidence of unilateral cultural domination. Hellenization in Thrace was neither uniform nor imposed through conquest during the 5th century BCE. Instead, it emerged from sustained contact shaped by mutual benefit. Greek city-states required access to Thracian grain, timber, metals, and manpower. The Odrysian monarchy benefited from Mediterranean trade, military partnerships, and prestige goods. Cultural exchange accompanied economic and political cooperation. The adoption of Greek forms also reinforced internal hierarchies. Mastery of Greek language, familiarity with Mediterranean customs, and access to imported goods distinguished the aristocracy from rural populations. Elite participation in Hellenic culture became a marker of status. This differentiation likely widened social gaps within the kingdom. Rural communities retained traditional material culture and burial customs with minimal Greek influence. Thus, hybridization occurred most prominently at the top of society. Diplomatic marriages further complicated cultural dynamics. Alliances between Thracian rulers and Greek families facilitated personal networks across regional boundaries. Such unions encouraged bilingual environments within royal courts. Children raised in these contexts would have navigated both Thracian and Greek cultural expectations. The court became a space of negotiation where identity was flexible rather than fixed. Religious life also reflected adaptation. Greek deities were identified with local counterparts, creating syncretic interpretations. Rather than abandoning indigenous cults, Thracian elites sometimes equated them with familiar Greek figures. This interpretation process allowed cross-cultural understanding without erasing local cosmology. Sanctuaries incorporated architectural features reminiscent of Greek temples, while maintaining regional ritual traditions. Military organization reveals additional layers of influence. Greek mercenaries served in Thracian armies, and Thracian troops fought in Greek conflicts. Exposure to hoplite tactics and equipment influenced elite warfare styles, yet Thracian light infantry and cavalry remained distinctive. Cultural borrowing in military contexts was pragmatic, focused on effectiveness rather than ideological alignment. Artistic production illustrates the blending of motifs. Gold and silver vessels from elite hordes combine Greek decorative patterns with indigenous forms. The craftsmanship demonstrates local adaptation of foreign styles. Workshops likely included artisans trained in Hellenic techniques working for Thracian patrons. Patronage shaped aesthetic direction, ensuring that imported forms aligned with local tastes. Economic integration intensified these exchanges. Trade routes connecting Thrace to Aegean ports facilitated continuous movement of goods and ideas. Greek merchants established enduring relationships with inland elites. Tribute collected by Odrysian kings may have been partially converted into imported luxury items, reinforcing the association between royal authority and Mediterranean connectivity. Despite these developments, cultural boundaries remained visible. Thracian tribal identities persisted, and linguistic continuity is evident in personal names preserved on inscriptions. Greek observers continued to describe Thracians as distinct, often emphasizing differences in dress, warfare, and custom. Cultural adaptation did not dissolve ethnic identity. By the 4th century BCE, the Odrysian elite operated within a transregional cultural sphere. Participation in Hellenic artistic and political norms enhanced diplomatic flexibility and economic opportunity. Yet the foundation of authority remained anchored in indigenous aristocratic traditions, including equestrian symbolism, tumulus burial, and tribal allegiance. Hybrid culture strengthened external relations while consolidating internal hierarchy. The Odrysian treasury was built on land, metal, and obligation. The economic strength of the Odrysian Kingdom rested not on urban industry or maritime dominance, but on territorial control and systematic extraction. Its rulers governed a region rich in natural resources, fertile plains capable of producing surplus grain, dense forests supplying valuable timber, and mineral zones yielding gold and silver. Political authority was inseparable from the management of these assets. Tribute, agricultural production, and access to strategic materials formed the material foundation of Odrysian power. Ancient testimony provides rare numerical insight into this system. In his account of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides remarks upon the wealth of the Odrysian kings and describes tribute payments collected from subordinate tribes and Greek cities. He records that the Odrysian monarch received substantial annual revenues in precious metal and goods. Although exact figures must be interpreted cautiously, the testimony indicates organized and recurring extraction rather than sporadic plunder. Tribute was institutionalized. The structure of this tribute system reflects the political composition of the kingdom. The Odrysian state did not erase tribal autonomy. Instead, it imposed hierarchical relationships upon pre-existing communities. Local chieftains retained authority over their territories, but acknowledged Odrysian supremacy through payments in silver, livestock, grain, and military service. These obligations reinforced both economic dependency and political subordination. Agriculture formed the backbone of regional wealth. Thrace contained extensive plains, particularly in the Hebrus, Maritsa Valley and surrounding lowlands. These areas supported cereal cultivation on a scale capable of generating surplus. Grain production not only sustained local populations but also enabled participation in external trade networks. Greek coastal cities depended upon inland supplies during periods of scarcity, increasing the strategic value of Thracian farmland. Control over fertile territory was therefore synonymous with fiscal stability. Kings who consolidated plains regions strengthened their capacity to reward followers and finance military campaigns. Conversely, fragmentation of territorial control reduced consistent access to agricultural surplus, weakening royal authority. Land was not merely productive space. It was the primary source of redistributable wealth. Forestry represented another critical resource. Thracian forests supplied timber suitable for shipbuilding and construction. Greek states, particularly maritime powers, required reliable timber imports for naval expansion. Thrace's wooded interior thus became economically significant within Aegean geopolitics. The ability to regulate timber extraction and export enhanced the bargaining power of Odrysian rulers in diplomatic negotiations. Mineral wealth added further dimension. The mountainous regions of Thrace contained deposits of gold and silver. Mining activity in these zones likely predated Odrysian unification, but centralized control enabled more systematic exploitation. Precious metals functioned both as tribute and as raw material for coinage and elite display. Archaeological discoveries of gold vessels and jewelry attest to advanced metalworking traditions and access to substantial resources. The connection between mineral wealth and political authority is particularly evident in royal burials. Gold artifacts recovered from Thracian tombs demonstrate concentrated accumulation of precious materials within elite circles. Such wealth was not solely decorative. It symbolized control over productive zones and validated aristocratic dominance. The capacity to distribute gold gifts reinforced loyalty networks among subordinate leaders. Redistribution lay at the heart of Odrysian governance. Tribute collected from peripheral tribes and allied cities was not hoarded exclusively. Kings redistributed wealth through feasting, gift exchange, and military patronage. This process maintained cohesion among diverse groups integrated into the kingdom. Authority depended less on bureaucratic administration than on personal bonds reinforced by economic generosity. The reign of Sitalces illustrates the scale such systems could achieve. His capacity to mobilize large armies, as described by classical sources, presupposes access to significant resources. Feeding and equipping troops required stable surplus extraction. Tribute in kind, grain, livestock, and metals, would have sustained prolonged campaigns and diplomatic initiatives alike. Livestock production also contributed to the economy. Thracian pastoralism supplied horses, cattle, and sheep. Horses held particular importance due to their military value and symbolic association with elite status. Control of pastureland supported cavalry strength, which in turn reinforced the monarchy's military advantage. Animal wealth functioned both economically and strategically. The geographic diversity of Thrace meant that economic specialization varied by region. Plains focused on grain cultivation. Upland areas supported herding and mining. Forested zones provided timber. The monarchy's ability to integrate these zones into a coherent tribute network determined its fiscal resilience. Fragmentation disrupted flows of goods and undermined centralized redistribution. Greek city-states along the coast occupied an intermediary position within this system. Some paid tribute directly, others engaged in negotiated trade relationships. In either case, inland resource control gave Odrysian rulers leverage. Grain exports, timber shipments, and access to mineral products could be regulated in response to political developments. Economic extraction was not purely exploitative. Tribute relationships also provided security guarantees. Subordinate tribes benefited from inclusion within a broader defensive framework. The monarchy's capacity to deter external threats justified tribute demands. Economic obligation and military protection were mutually reinforcing components of state structure. Coinage further institutionalized resource management. The minting of silver coins under later rulers signaled formalized fiscal mechanisms. Coin production required stable access to metal supplies and implied standardization of exchange. Although barter and payment in kind persisted, coinage facilitated larger-scale transactions and integration into Mediterranean markets. Agricultural cycles structured the rhythm of revenue collection. Tribute in grain would have been assessed seasonally, requiring coordination between royal agents and local producers. While direct bureaucratic evidence is scarce, logistical consistency implied administrative oversight. The scale of recorded revenues suggests organized assessment rather than arbitrary seizure. Economic inequality likely intensified as tribute systems matured. Elites positioned close to the royal court benefited disproportionately from redistributed wealth. Peripheral communities bore extraction burdens while receiving limited participation in high-status exchange networks. Such disparities may have contributed to periodic instability when royal authority weakened. Nevertheless, the overall structure proved durable during periods of strong leadership. By aligning economic extraction with traditional systems of loyalty and kinship, Odrysian kings embedded fiscal control within familiar social frameworks. Tribute was presented not as foreign imposition but as acknowledgement of hierarchical order. Environmental factors also shaped economic outcomes. Climatic variation affected harvest yields, influencing the monarchy's capacity to sustain military and diplomatic commitments. Control over diverse ecological zones mitigated risk by diversifying resource streams. A kingdom spanning plains, forests, and mountains possessed inherent economic resilience. By the 4th century BCE, the cumulative effect of tribute extraction, agricultural surplus, and mineral exploitation had produced a state recognized for its wealth. Greek observers characterized the Odrysian monarchy as among the most prosperous non-Greek powers in southeastern Europe. This reputation rested not on urban commerce but on effective control of land and obligation. Economic foundations underpinned every dimension of Odrysian authority. Military campaigns, diplomatic alliances, religious patronage, and elite display all depended upon reliable access to resources. Land produced grain, mountains yielded metal, forests supplied timber, subordinate communities provided tribute. Together they sustained the treasury. Trade routes made Thrace strategically indispensable. The Odrysian kingdom's economic power extended beyond tribute and resource control, reaching into commercial networks connecting the Danube, the interior of Thrace, and the Aegean coast. Its geography provided natural corridors for the movement of goods. Rivers such as the Hebrus, Maritsa, facilitated north-south transport, while passes through the Rhodope and Hemus mountains enabled east-west connections. Control over these arteries allowed Odrysian rulers to regulate and tax trade, consolidating wealth and reinforcing political authority. Greek colonies along the northern Aegean, such as Apollonia Pontica and Maroneia, acted as intermediaries between Thracian producers and Mediterranean markets. These settlements imported Thracian timber, metal, grain, and livestock, while exporting Greek pottery, coinage, luxury goods, and finished products. Archaeological evidence of amphory and imported ceramics in Thracian hill forts and elite burials illustrates the circulation of goods across these networks. Coin hoards recovered from central Thrace indicate that monetary exchange had reached the elite level by the 4th century BCE. Rulers issued silver coins bearing their names and symbols, enabling standardized transactions with Greek merchants and facilitating tribute payments in a more portable form than raw metal or agricultural produce. Nevertheless, rural economies remained largely barter-based. Local trade in grain, livestock, and craft goods persisted outside the influence of centralized monetary systems, demonstrating that economic integration was partial and stratified. The kingdom's control of key trade corridors conferred strategic advantages. By regulating access to inland routes, the Odrysian kings could monitor foreign merchants, levy tolls, and influence the flow of resources. Diplomatic agreements with Greek cities often formalized these rights. Thucydides reports that during Sitalces' reign, Athenian envoys negotiated safe passage and tribute arrangements for trade moving through Odrysian territory. Such agreements highlight the dual economic and political function of Thracian corridors. River transport enabled the bulk movement of heavy commodities, particularly timber and metals. Logs floated downstream to ports, where Greek merchants could process and redistribute them. Likewise, gold and silver from mountain mines could be transported overland to coastal hubs for minting or trade. Archaeological findings, including metal ingots and workshop debris, confirm the existence of both raw material extraction and localized processing within Thrace. Maritime connections amplified the kingdom's economic reach. Aegean trade allowed Thracian products to enter broader Mediterranean markets, linking the Odrysian elite to commerce in the Cyclades, mainland Greece, and Asia Minor. Imported luxury goods, such as painted ceramics and metal vessels, reinforced social status among the aristocracy while simultaneously providing material evidence of cross-cultural interaction. Greek city-states benefited from these networks as well. Access to Thracian grain, timber, and metals supplied essential resources for urban economies, shipbuilding, and military campaigns. Reciprocal trade fostered a system in which Thrace was simultaneously a source of wealth and a necessary partner in regional commerce. Odrysian rulers leveraged this interdependence to enhance both economic and diplomatic influence. Infrastructure supporting trade included fortified hill settlements and seasonal gathering points. These locations served as collection centers for tribute and commercial goods, facilitating storage, redistribution, and taxation. Archaeological surveys reveal ceramic assemblages, storage pits, and evidence of workshop activity in central Thrace, suggesting organized management of commodities prior to export. Subordinate tribal authorities were integral to maintaining these networks. Local rulers oversaw collection and transport of goods from their territories, ensuring delivery to river ports or central collection points. The decentralized political system relied on cooperation between the monarchy and regional elites to regulate trade, demonstrating the interdependence of political hierarchy and economic control. Coinage and Greek inscriptions indicate that trade networks were not purely informal. Odrysian rulers adopted Hellenic methods of recording transactions, minting currency, and negotiating with merchants in Greek. Such integration facilitated commerce with foreign partners, reducing transactional friction and increasing revenues derived from taxation and tribute. Despite these advances, the rural population remained largely outside monetized exchange systems. Barter in grain, livestock, and craft goods persisted locally, highlighting the selective penetration of currency. The coexistence of monetized elite economy and subsistence barter illustrates the stratified nature of Odrysian economic development. Military security of trade routes was a constant concern. Control over passes, rivers, and key junctions allowed the monarchy to protect economic flows from banditry or rival incursions. Thracian cavalry, supported by levied troops from subordinate tribes, patrolled these corridors, ensuring both internal compliance and external defense. Effective management of trade was inseparable from military oversight. Seasonal cycles shaped commercial activity. Grain shipments followed harvest periods. Timber and livestock movements adjusted to grazing patterns. Monsoonal rains and winter river levels influenced transport efficiency, requiring coordination between central authorities and local producers. These logistical considerations demonstrate the complexity of Thracian trade administration despite the absence of a centralized bureaucracy. By controlling trade networks and linking inland resources to the Aegean, the Odrysian monarchy could finance large-scale projects, maintain military forces, and support ceremonial obligations. Wealth generated from commerce complemented tribute and agriculture, reinforcing the kingdom's fiscal base. Economic expansion facilitated cultural exchange. Goods transported along trade routes carried not only material value but also ideas, artistic motifs, and technological knowledge. Greek ceramics, metalworking techniques, and literacy practices reached Thrace, while Thracian products circulated into Greek markets, contributing to a shared cultural sphere. Trade also enhanced diplomatic leverage. Thracian rulers could offer access to markets or restrict passage as part of alliance negotiations. Greek city-states recognized the strategic importance of Thracian corridors, often adjusting military and commercial policies accordingly. The interplay between trade and politics illustrates how economic integration reinforced Odrysian influence regionally. By the late 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the kingdom's economic networks had become complex and multidimensional. Tribute, resource control, and trade functioned together to sustain the monarchy's wealth and authority. River and mountain corridors, Aegean ports, and Greek intermediary cities formed a durable commercial infrastructure connecting Thrace to the wider Mediterranean. Thracian soldiers became indispensable across the Greek world. The military of the Odrysian Kingdom was closely linked to its social hierarchy. Aristocratic elites maintained mounted units, while broader tribal levies provided infantry. Military service functioned as both a political obligation and a marker of social status, reinforcing the authority of local dynasts and the central monarchy. Greek historians, particularly Xenophon and Thucydides, provide detailed accounts of Thracian troop composition and battlefield roles, emphasizing mobility, irregular tactics, and cavalry proficiency. Elite cavalry formed the backbone of Odrysian forces. Mounted nobles supplied their own horses, arms, and equipment, demonstrating wealth and military capability. Archaeological evidence, including horse harnesses, bits, and tumulus burials containing equestrian gear, confirms the centrality of cavalry to aristocratic identity. The Odrysian cavalry was deployed for reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, and rapid raids, exploiting the mountainous terrain of Thrace and surrounding regions. Infantry forces were primarily tribal levies raised from subjugated territories. These included lightly armed peltasts, skilled in javelin throwing and hit-and-run tactics, and heavier spearmen deployed in defensive formations. Greek mercenary accounts describe Thracian infantry as unpredictable but highly effective in skirmishes and raids. The emphasis on mobility allowed Odrysian forces to operate across diverse terrains, from river valleys to upland passes. Military organization was decentralized but coordinated through royal command. Kings such as Sitalces summoned troops from allied and subordinate tribes to support campaigns, relying on local dynasts to supply and command units. Coordination depended on personal loyalty, regular assemblies, and symbolic demonstrations of royal authority rather than standardized hierarchical structures. Participation in military campaigns reinforced social stratification. Service conferred prestige, access to loot, and recognition from the king. Elite warriors augmented their status through leadership roles in battle, while tribal levies solidified obligations to dynastic rulers. Military capability thus intersected with economic and political authority. Greek sources also record Thracians serving as mercenaries in wider Mediterranean conflicts. Xenophon's Anabasis describes Thracian cavalry and light infantry supporting Greek expeditions, highlighting their mobility and effectiveness in unconventional warfare. This external engagement demonstrates both the reputation and adaptability of Odrysian military practices. Logistics were managed through seasonal campaigning cycles. River routes facilitated troop movement and supply transport, while local communities provided food, fodder, and shelter. The combination of geographic knowledge, mobility, and flexible organization allowed the Odrysian army to operate across extensive distances without permanent garrisoning. Weaponry and armor reflect tactical specialization. Cavalry units used spears, swords, and composite bows, while peltasts relied on javelins, small shields, and light protective gear. Tumuli and burial assemblages corroborate these descriptions, indicating differentiation in armament according to social rank and battlefield role. The integration of military service with aristocratic identity reinforced loyalty networks. Success in battle enhanced dynastic prestige, legitimizing authority within a decentralized political system. Kings depended on demonstrated martial capability to maintain tribute compliance and secure regional allegiance. Size alone did not guarantee endurance. The Odrysian Kingdom under rulers such as Sitalces demonstrated remarkable territorial ambition, extending influence from the Aegean coast to the Danube. However, this expansion exposed structural limits inherent to the decentralized nature of the Odrysian state. While tribute and alliances provided resources for campaigns, the lack of centralized administration complicated coordination across distant regions. Long supply lines represented a persistent challenge. Armies drawn from multiple tribal territories required provisions, forage, and shelter over hundreds of kilometers. Seasonal variations affected river transport, road passability, and grazing availability, reducing operational flexibility. Greek sources note that during campaigns into Macedonia in 429 BCE, Odrysian forces advanced rapidly but faced difficulties sustaining extended operations. Logistical constraints ultimately curtailed the reach and duration of military expeditions. Communication between royal command and subordinate dynasts posed additional complications. Orders had to traverse mountain passes and river valleys, and local leaders often interpreted instructions according to regional priorities. While personal loyalty and ritualized obeisance reinforced coordination, these mechanisms were less reliable than formalized hierarchies or bureaucracies. The decentralized chain of command slowed responsiveness and limited strategic cohesion. Integration of diverse tribal contingents further complicated operations. Each unit maintained its own leadership, tactics, and local obligations. Synchronizing movements, Timing attacks and consolidating forces required negotiation and trust, particularly when tribes retained autonomous control over land and resources. Greek observers emphasized that Thracian armies excelled in mobility and skirmish warfare, yet large-scale, sustained campaigns remained challenging. The reliance on mercenary support during extended operations highlights these structural constraints. Xenophon describes Southeastern II recruiting Greek soldiers during internal conflicts, supplementing tribal levies whose loyalty could be regionally limited. Mercenaries provided disciplined units capable of coordinated maneuvers, but their integration required additional logistical planning, remuneration, and oversight. Resource allocation further limited expansion. Armies consumed significant quantities of grain, livestock, and forage, reducing reserves available for domestic administration or tribute redistribution. Delays or shortfalls could undermine morale and the perception of royal authority. Without permanent depots or centralized storehouses, kings relied on the goodwill and compliance of subordinate leaders to supply necessary provisions. Geography imposed natural constraints on territorial control. Mountainous terrain hindered the movement of heavy equipment, restricted the ability to concentrate forces, and isolated distant contingents. Rivers, while useful for transport, were subject to seasonal flooding or low water levels, disrupting supply continuity. These environmental factors amplified the inherent limitations of a decentralized military system. Strategic overextension became evident in campaigns toward Macedonia. While initial advances showcased the Odrysian army's mobility and effectiveness, sustaining occupation or imposing tribute required ongoing reinforcement. Greek chroniclers note that the campaign's ultimate impact was limited by logistical bottlenecks, tribal resistance, and coordination difficulties. Success in rapid raids did not translate into durable political control. Internal fragmentation amplified these challenges. Multiple Odrysian subkings could act independently, sometimes prioritizing local defense or political advantage over broader campaign objectives. Rivalries among dynasts could delay mobilization, disrupt cohesion, or create competing claims to military authority. The decentralized political framework that facilitated rapid levies also constrained sustained, centralized campaigns. Seasonal constraints further shaped military strategy. Campaigns were often planned around harvest cycles, river navigability, and pasture availability for cavalry. Adverse weather could halt operations entirely, limiting the kingdom's capacity to project power continuously. Unlike Greek city-states with concentrated logistical bases or Macedonia with royal storehouses, Odrysian rulers had to negotiate supply access from multiple semi-autonomous territories. These structural limitations informed both offensive and defensive planning. Odrysian kings optimized for mobility, surprise, and regional engagement rather than protracted sieges or long-term occupations. Cavalry raids, light infantry skirmishes, and rapid incursions were preferred methods for leveraging military strength without overextending resources. The kingdom's strategy reflected adaptation to logistical realities as much as tactical doctrine. Financial considerations intersected with logistical constraints. Tribute collection supported provisioning but required coordination with subkings and local elites. Delays or disputes in tribute undermined the army's operational readiness. Currency, while increasingly used among elites, did not entirely replace in-kind contributions, complicating supply chains. The decentralized economic system reinforced corresponding military limits. By the mid-5th century BCE, it was clear that territorial breadth imposed trade-offs. While the Odrysian monarchy could command significant resources and field sizable forces, the lack of permanent infrastructure, centralized administration, and codified command hierarchies restricted the scale and sustainability of military expansion. Campaigns succeeded when rapid, flexible action was possible but faltered when prolonged occupation or distant governance was required. These limits directly influenced the kingdom's subsequent engagement in major conflicts. Military strategy had to account for logistical feasibility, tribal cooperation, and seasonal constraints. Expansion was balanced against the capacity to maintain cohesion, protect supply lines, and ensure continued tribute flow. The interplay of territorial ambition and logistical reality shaped the operational reach of the Odrysian army and set the stage for confrontation with neighboring powers, Thrace became entangled in Greek power struggles. The Odrysian Kingdom was not isolated from the political currents of the Greek world. During the 5th century BCE, Odrysian rulers actively engaged in diplomatic and military maneuvers connected to the Peloponnesian War. Alliances with Athens, Sparta, and other city-states provided revenue, strategic leverage, and political recognition, while simultaneously exposing the kingdom to the complexities of interstate conflict. Greek literary sources, particularly Thucydides, document these interactions in detail, illustrating the dual role of diplomacy and warfare in Odrysian strategy. Under Sitalces, the Odrysian Kingdom entered a formal alliance with Athens in 431 BCE. The agreement was motivated by both strategic and economic considerations. Athens sought Thracian support to secure grain routes and buffer zones in the northern Aegean, while Sitalces leveraged Athenian resources and recognition to consolidate authority over subordinate tribes. Tribute, military contingents, and coordinated raids formed part of the exchange, linking Thracian obligations with Greek strategic interests. Odrysian involvement in Greek conflicts frequently manifested as proxy warfare. Rather than deploying armies directly into the heart of Greek campaigns, the kingdom supplied troops, cavalry, and logistical support to allied city-states. Classical sources note Thracian cavalry and peltasts participating in operations against Macedonian and regional adversaries. These engagements allowed the Odrysian monarchy to exercise influence beyond its borders without assuming the full burden of sustained occupation. Tribute payments and economic incentives reinforced alliance obligations. Athens, in particular, provided monetary support for Odrysian troops and recognized the political authority of Sitalces through diplomatic correspondence. Greek city-states benefited from access to Thracian resources, including timber, grain, and manpower, while the Odrysian monarchy gained prestige and leverage over neighboring tribes. The alliance thus served both transactional and symbolic functions. Odrysian rulers also engaged in selective military campaigns aligned with Greek interests. The 429 BCE expedition into Macedonia illustrates the intersection of diplomatic obligation and strategic ambition. While the campaign demonstrated Thracian military capability, it also revealed the kingdom's operational limits. Coordination across multiple tribal contingents, long supply lines, and geographic challenges constrained the effectiveness of extended operations, highlighting the balance between participation in Greek conflicts and preservation of domestic stability. The use of Greek mercenaries supplemented Odrysian forces when specialized skills or discipline were required. Mercenaries provided expertise in siege warfare, phalanx tactics, or naval support, compensating for structural weaknesses in decentralized tribal levies. Payment and logistical arrangements for mercenaries were recorded in inscriptions and treaties, indicating a sophisticated approach to military integration with external actors. Alliances occasionally exposed internal divisions. Subordinate dynasts held varying levels of commitment to royal directives, and some operated independently in negotiation with Greek city-states. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that individual Odrysian rulers occasionally concluded agreements that prioritized local advantage, reflecting the decentralized nature of the kingdom. Such autonomy complicated sustained participation in Greek wars and sometimes undermined collective strategy. Greek historians highlight the political acumen of Odrysian rulers in leveraging their position. By acting as a regional intermediary, the monarchy controlled access to trade routes and resources critical to Greek states. Athens and its allies relied on Thracian support to maintain northern supply lines and secure frontier regions. Odrysian participation functioned both as military contribution and strategic leverage. The intersection of diplomacy and economic interests was reinforced by cultural exchange. Elite Odrysians familiar with Greek language, customs, and ceremonial practices could negotiate effectively with city-state envoys. Coinage, inscriptions, and Greek-style luxury goods facilitated communication and signaled political sophistication, enhancing the kingdom's reputation among Greek partners. Participation in Greek conflicts also created precedents for future military and diplomatic interaction with neighboring powers. By engaging in alliances, supporting proxy campaigns, and navigating interstate politics, the Odrysian monarchy developed mechanisms for influence that extended beyond the Balkans. These experiences would shape subsequent relations with Macedonia and other regional actors. Control over tribal contingents was critical to alliance enforcement. Royal authority ensured that levy contributions, tribute deliveries, and campaign participation were maintained. The social and economic incentives associated with military service, prestige, wealth distribution, and loyalty reinforcement underpin the kingdom's capacity to fulfill obligations to Greek allies while maintaining internal stability. Seasonal and geographic considerations shaped Thracian engagement. Campaign timing, river transport availability, and pasture access for cavalry affected the scale and duration of operations. Coordination with Greek allies required flexibility to accommodate these environmental constraints, underscoring the adaptive character of Odrysian military diplomacy. Through these alliances, the Odrysian Kingdom became an active participant in broader Hellenic geopolitics. Thrace's strategic position, abundant resources, and mobile forces made it a valuable partner and a potential adversary in Greek calculations. Diplomatic engagement offered both opportunity and risk, integrating Odrysian rulers into a network of interstate relations without full subordination to external authority. A new power rose on Thrace's western frontier. By the early 4th century BCE, Macedonia under kings such as Achaemenid III and later Philip II increasingly projected influence into Thracian lands. Odrysian rulers faced sustained geopolitical pressure as Macedonian armies advanced into border regions, while strategic alliances and vassalage arrangements extended the reach of the Macedonian state. Greek sources, including Diodorus Siculus and Demosthenes, document a series of conflicts, negotiated settlements, and tributary arrangements that gradually limited Odrysian autonomy. Macedonian encroachment exploited both military capability and political fragmentation. The decentralized structure of the Odrysian Kingdom, while effective for internal cohesion and rapid tribal mobilization, proved vulnerable to coordinated external campaigns. Macedonian forces, combining disciplined phalanx infantry, cavalry, and engineering capabilities, challenged Thracian mobility and imposed sieges on key settlements. Local subkings, at times competing for authority, were compelled to negotiate individually with Macedonian envoys, weakening centralized resistance. Treaties served as intermittent stabilizers. Macedonian rulers often formalized vassalage or tribute agreements to secure temporary peace, ensuring access to resources and trade routes without immediate occupation. These arrangements included annual tribute, military contingents, and recognition of Macedonian suzerainty. Such treaties reflect a pragmatic adaptation by Odrysian rulers, balancing survival with the preservation of internal authority. Armed conflict alternated with diplomacy. Campaigns into Thracian territory demonstrated both Macedonian strategic ambition and Odrysian resilience. While Thracian cavalry and peltasts effectively harassed invading forces, sustained occupation proved difficult. Greek historians note that Odrysian resistance could delay or disrupt Macedonian operations, but long-term territorial gains favored the expanding Macedonian state. The threat from Macedonia prompted strategic recalibration within the Odrysian monarchy. Kings reinforced control over critical passes, river valleys, and fortified settlements to defend economically and militarily vital zones. Elite forces were concentrated around key centers, while tribal levies were mobilized for defensive operations and border patrol. This defensive posture reshaped military deployment priorities, reducing the flexibility previously afforded by rapid offensive campaigns. Economic implications were significant. Macedonian influence constrained the collection of tribute and access to Aegean trade routes. Control over northern corridors and riverine transport alternated between Odrysian and Macedonian oversight, directly affecting the kingdom's fiscal capacity. Coinage circulation and market integration adapted accordingly, with elites negotiating to maintain economic flows under shifting geopolitical conditions. Diplomatic negotiation became increasingly sophisticated. Odrysian rulers engaged in marriage alliances, tribute settlements, and selective cooperation with Greek city-states to counterbalance Macedonian pressure. Evidence from inscriptions indicates that certain subkings concluded independent arrangements with external powers, reflecting both the decentralization of the Odrysian polity and the necessity of pragmatic flexibility in the face of a rising hegemon. Military adaptation accompanied these diplomatic measures. Thracian forces emphasized rapid response, ambush tactics, and utilization of difficult terrain to offset the Macedonian phalanx. Cavalry units were deployed to harass supply lines, while peltasts conducted reconnaissance and skirmishing to delay enemy consolidation. Such adjustments highlight the interaction between geopolitical pressure and operational innovation. By the mid-4th century BCE, Macedonian expansion under Philip II created a persistent external challenge. Philip's combination of military reform, diplomatic negotiation, and regional alliances steadily encroached on Thracian autonomy. Odrysian kings retained nominal authority over subordinate tribes, but the scope of independent action diminished. Strategic concessions became a necessary component of statecraft. The pressure from Macedonia also affected internal politics. Competition among sub-kings intensified, as some aligned with Macedonian interests to secure personal advantage. Such divisions compounded the structural vulnerabilities inherent in a federated monarchy, reducing the kingdom's ability to present a unified front. Greek sources document episodes in which Macedonian backing favored particular Odrysian claimants, further destabilizing internal cohesion. Geopolitical pressure stimulated urban and administrative responses. Settlements such as Southopolis were fortified and strategically positioned to control river valleys, trade routes, and passes vulnerable to Macedonian incursions. These measures reflect both the defensive adaptation of the kingdom and the broader integration of economic, military, and geographic considerations in response to external threat. Despite these pressures, the Odrysian Kingdom retained sufficient territorial control, economic resources, and military capability to maintain regional influence. Macedonian encroachment imposed constraints, but it also incentivized more coordinated leadership, defensive consolidation, and strategic diplomacy. The kingdom's ability to balance autonomy with pragmatic accommodation defined its trajectory in this period. This period of sustained Macedonian pressure illustrates the long-term structural challenge posed by an emergent centralized power. Odrysian resilience was tested, yet the kingdom adapted by combining fortified centers, flexible tribal levies, and selective diplomacy. The interplay between internal organization and external force reveals the complex dynamics shaping Thracian geopolitics in the early 4th century BCE. One ruler delayed decline through force and negotiation. Teres I ascended to the Odrysian throne around 383 BCE during a period of internal fragmentation and external pressure. The kingdom had been weakened by dynastic rivalries and the expanding influence of Macedonia. Teres' approach combined assertive diplomacy, administrative centralization, and military revitalization, briefly restoring stability and cohesion to the Odrysian state. Greek historians, including Demosthenes and Diodorus Siculus, record Teres' strategic interventions, emphasizing his ability to unify previously competing subkings and coordinate military campaigns across disparate tribal territories. Administrative measures focused on strengthening tribute collection and consolidating fiscal authority. Teres reinforced the itinerant monarchy system, personally overseeing payments from subordinate tribes and establishing reliable channels for resource transfer to the royal court. These efforts ensured a more predictable revenue stream, enabling the financing of armies, elite patronage, and fortification projects. Greek inscriptions from coastal settlements indicate continued coordination with Aegean cities, suggesting that trade and diplomacy remained integrated into administrative reform. Military revival was a key component of Teres' consolidation. Tribal levies were organized under centralized command for larger-scale campaigns, while elite cavalry units were expanded and equipped with improved weaponry. Strategic deployment emphasized both defensive control of border passes and offensive capability against regional rivals. Campaigns under Teres reasserted Odrysian authority in northern and central Thrace, deterring encroachment by Macedonia and reinforcing control over key trade routes. Diplomacy complemented military action. Teres pursued alliances with Greek city-states, balancing coercive power with negotiation. Tribute agreements, marriage alliances, and cooperative military arrangements extended Odrysian influence, while minimizing direct confrontation with more powerful neighbors. This dual strategy, force where necessary, diplomacy when advantageous, enabled the kingdom to temporarily recover regional prominence. Territorial unity under Cotys was reinforced by managing internal rivalries. Subordinate dynasts were integrated into the kingdom's central strategy through a combination of coercion, incentivization, and personal loyalty networks. Feasts, gifts, and redistribution of tribute functioned as tools for consolidating allegiance, while selective military appointments ensured participation in campaigns without empowering potential challengers. Resource management was closely tied to these political and military reforms. Agricultural output, mining of precious metals, and timber extraction were systematically organized to support both domestic administration and external engagements. Cotys' ability to mobilize these economic resources underpinned military campaigns and maintained the confidence of subkings and allied Greek cities. By combining administrative oversight, military coordination, and strategic diplomacy, Cotys temporarily reversed the decline that had threatened Odrysian autonomy. His reign demonstrates the impact of individual leadership on state resilience, highlighting the capacity of the monarchy to leverage decentralized tribal structures for coordinated action. Stability vanished as quickly as it returned. The assassination of Cotys I in 359 BCE triggered a rapid disintegration of centralized authority within the Odrysian Kingdom. His death removed the central figure capable of coordinating tribute collection, military campaigns, and tribal loyalty networks. Competing heirs and subkings immediately asserted claims to territory, leading to overlapping jurisdictions, conflicting alliances, and intermittent internecine conflict. Greek sources, including Demosthenes and Diodorus Siculus, document multiple Odrysian rulers negotiating independently with neighboring states, reflecting the collapse of unified command. Regional dynasts reasserted autonomy over their territories. Key cities and strategic passes came under the control of local rulers, undermining the kingdom's ability to coordinate defense or collect tribute consistently. The previously itinerant monarchy, dependent on personal authority and loyalty, could no longer enforce compliance. Subordinate leaders engaged in separate treaties, sometimes aligning with Macedonia or Greek city-states to secure their own position, further fragmenting political cohesion. Military organization deteriorated. Without a central coordinating authority, levies were raised locally rather than in concerted campaigns. Cavalry units and peltasts, previously deployed under royal command for strategic objectives, were dispersed among competing dynasts. The kingdom's capacity to project force beyond immediate territorial holdings diminished sharply, leaving northern and western borders vulnerable. Economic administration suffered as tribute collection became inconsistent. Local rulers retained a larger share of resources, weakening the fiscal capacity of any central authority. Strategic trade routes connecting the Danube and Aegean were increasingly negotiated independently by subkings, reducing Odrysian leverage in regional commerce. Coinage circulation and organized trade agreements were disrupted, affecting both domestic and foreign economic stability. Diplomatic coherence also collapsed. Odrysian representatives no longer presented a unified position in negotiations with Athens, other Greek city-states, or Macedonia. Treaties concluded by individual subkings were often contradictory, creating opportunities for external powers to manipulate internal divisions to their advantage. Greek inscriptions record instances where neighboring polities successfully negotiated with one Odrysian faction to the detriment of others. This period of fragmentation exposed the kingdom to external exploitation. Macedonia, under Philip II, capitalized on the disunity by advancing territorial claims, negotiating favorable vassalage arrangements with specific subkings, and intervening militarily when advantageous. The absence of centralized resistance allowed the Macedonians to expand influence without requiring prolonged conquest. Internal rivalries created cycles of conflict that prevented consolidation. Subkings contested borders, clashed over resources, and sought external alliances to outmaneuver rivals. Such disputes further weakened the kingdom's collective military and economic capacity, rendering previous gains under Cotys I ephemeral. By the late 4th century BCE, the Odrysian Kingdom had ceased to function as a coherent political entity. Authority remained nominally in the hands of royal lineages, but practical control was dispersed among competing dynasts. The resulting fragmentation set the stage for Macedonian dominance and marked the final phase of Odrysian territorial autonomy. Thracian independence ended without a single decisive battle. By the mid-4th century BCE, Philip II of Macedon had consolidated his power and turned attention toward the Odrysian Kingdom. Unlike campaigns characterized by pitched battles, Philip relied on a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and selective military action to bring Thrace under Macedonian control. Greek historians, including Diodorus Siculus and Demosthenes, describe a systematic approach in which Macedonian influence extended through vassalage, tribute arrangements, and the co-optation of local rulers, gradually eroding Odrysian autonomy. Philip exploited the fragmentation that followed Cody's I's death. Competing heirs and subkings, previously independent and often in conflict, became instruments of Macedonian policy. Some rulers negotiated directly with Philip, accepting vassal status, tribute obligations, or military cooperation in exchange for retaining local authority. Others were compelled by the presence of Macedonian forces or the threat of annexation to submit. This method minimized large-scale warfare while maximizing political control. The Macedonian army provided both coercive and stabilizing influence. Philip stationed garrisons in key towns, secured strategic river crossings, and supervised frontier passes. Thracian cavalry and infantry units were incorporated into Macedonian campaigns, often serving under Macedonian command. In this way, military integration reinforced political subjugation while maintaining the utility of Odrysian forces for regional operations. Economic leverage complemented military and diplomatic tactics. Macedonia regulated tribute collection and controlled major trade corridors, particularly those linking the Danube and Aegean. By mediating access to Greek markets and enforcing tribute obligations, Philip ensured that Odrysian rulers were dependent on Macedonian approval for both fiscal and commercial activity. Inscriptions and coinage from this period indicate the introduction of Macedonian oversight in financial and administrative matters. Strategic marriages and familial alliances also facilitated subjugation. Philip's diplomacy incorporated Odrysian dynasts into Macedonian networks of obligation, binding local rulers to Macedonian political objectives. Such alliances reinforced vassalage and limited opportunities for rebellion. Greek sources note that these marriages often had immediate political utility, ensuring loyalty and cooperation from influential tribal leaders. Despite this subordination, Odrysian kings retained limited local authority. They continued to govern daily affairs within their territories, administer justice, and collect internal tribute. However, these powers were contingent on Macedonian approval and constrained by the overarching demands of vassalage. The monarchy transitioned from a sovereign state to a regional client system integrated into the Macedonian sphere of influence. Philip's approach emphasized gradual consolidation over outright destruction. By avoiding full-scale conquest, Macedonia maintained stability, co-opted local elites, and preserved the functionality of Odrysian administration. This method contrasts with other contemporary campaigns in which states were directly annexed or dismantled. The Odrysian Kingdom persisted nominally but lost effective independence. Cultural and religious practices continued under Macedonian oversight. Thracian elites maintained traditional ceremonies, burial customs, and cult observances, demonstrating that subjugation was primarily political rather than social or cultural. Archaeological evidence, including tumulus burials and elite artifacts, shows continuity in local traditions even as political authority shifted. Military obligations to Macedonia reshaped Odrysian forces. Subordinate kings provided troops for Philip's campaigns in Thrace and the wider Hellenic world. Cavalry, peltasts, and infantry were deployed under Macedonian command, reinforcing the kingdom's integration into regional military structures while limiting independent action. The Odrysian army's operational autonomy was effectively curtailed. By the late 4th century BCE, Odrysian rulers functioned largely as Macedonian clients. Tribute, military service, and allegiance formalized the kingdom's vassal status, marking the end of Odrysian sovereignty. Local governance persisted, but strategic decisions, external diplomacy, and large-scale military initiatives were subordinated to Macedonian interests. Conquest transformed governance, not identity. Following Philip II's subjugation of Thrace, the administrative landscape of the region was systematically reorganized under Macedonian authority. Local elites were integrated into a framework designed to extract tribute, secure borders, and facilitate military mobilization, while traditional tribal structures continued to function at a regional level. Greek sources, particularly Diodorus Siculus, note the appointment of client kings, oversight by Macedonian officers, and coordination of military contingents to maintain control without fully dismantling existing Odrysian governance. Tributary arrangements became formalized. Subordinate rulers were required to remit regular payments in silver, livestock, and other resources to Macedonian administrators. These contributions funded regional garrisons, military expeditions, and the broader Hellenistic network of economic and political obligations. Inscriptions and coin hoards indicate that local dynasts continued to exercise authority in domestic matters, including collection of in-kind tribute and local adjudication, but ultimate approval rested with Macedonian oversight. Military organization reflected similar integration. Thracian cavalry and infantry units were retained but deployed according to Macedonian strategic priorities. Subordinate kings provided levies for campaigns in the northern Aegean, Macedon, and beyond, reinforcing Macedonia's regional dominance while limiting the capacity for independent Odrysian operations. Greek historians emphasize that these forces remained valuable for their mobility and knowledge of local terrain. Urban and regional administration was adapted to Hellenistic practices. Key settlements, including riverine and coastal towns, functioned as administrative hubs, coordinating tribute, trade, and military activity. Macedonian officials oversaw these centers, while local elites retained ceremonial and practical authority. Archaeological evidence, such as Macedonian-style fortifications and administrative inscriptions, demonstrates the blending of native governance structures with Hellenistic bureaucratic methods. Diplomacy remained a tool for local rulers within this framework. Client kings engaged with Greek city-states, neighboring Thracian tribes, and Macedonian authorities to negotiate trade, tribute, and military obligations. These interactions allowed local elites to maintain influence, demonstrating continuity of political agency despite overarching Macedonian control. Cultural identity persisted alongside administrative change. Thracian elites continued traditional religious practices, burial customs, and tribal ceremonies. Greek inscriptions and artistic artifacts suggest selective adoption of Hellenistic styles, particularly in urban centers, but archaeological evidence confirms the persistence of indigenous practices in rural regions and elite tombs. This combination of adaptation and continuity prevented wholesale cultural erasure while facilitating integration into the Macedonian political order. Strategically, the Macedonian administration prioritized key passes, river valleys, and trade corridors. Control over these areas ensured effective extraction of tribute and rapid deployment of military forces. Subordinate Odrysian rulers were responsible for local enforcement, while Macedonian officers monitored compliance, creating a multi-layered administrative system that balanced efficiency with localized knowledge. Economic integration extended beyond tribute. Thrace's natural resources, timber, metals, and agricultural products were incorporated into Hellenistic trade networks. Coastal settlements served as intermediaries for goods moving between the interior and Greek markets, ensuring continued economic vitality under Macedonian oversight. Coinage, both local and Macedonian, facilitated transactions and symbolized political alignment with Hellenistic authority. The flexibility of Odrysian elites enabled the region to remain administratively functional despite the political shift. By accommodating Macedonian oversight, local rulers preserved influence over domestic affairs, maintained elite networks, and ensured continuity of governance practices. This system exemplifies how conquest could reshape political structures without fully displacing pre-existing social and cultural frameworks. Military, economic, and administrative integration persisted under the Diadochi following Alexander's death. Successor kingdoms maintained tribute systems, client kingships, and regional garrisons, further consolidating Hellenistic control while retaining elements of Odrysian governance. Thrace became a component of the broader Hellenistic geopolitical network, with local elites mediating between Macedonian authority and regional populations. Despite this transformation, Thracian identity remained resilient. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in burial practices, material culture, and elite ceremonial life. Greek artistic motifs and coinage were adopted selectively, often for purposes of diplomacy or prestige, rather than as tools of cultural replacement. Indigenous structures persisted alongside Macedonian administration, illustrating the hybrid nature of Hellenistic governance in Thrace. Rome succeeded where others ruled indirectly. By 46 CE, the Roman Empire formally annexed Thrace, converting the region into a provincial entity. Unlike previous Odrysian or Macedonian administrations, Roman governance imposed standardized structures, including appointed governors, taxation systems, and legal frameworks. Tacitus and Cassius Dio note that the annexation followed decades of indirect Roman influence, where client kings administered the territory under Roman oversight. This formal incorporation ensured direct imperial control while maintaining some continuity of local customs. Provincial administration reorganized the territory into districts aligned with Roman logistical and military priorities. Governors were responsible for collecting tribute, administering justice, and coordinating regional defense. Roman military presence, including legions stationed along strategic passes and river valleys, secured borders and reinforced the authority of the imperial state. Local elites were co-opted into municipal councils or granted limited civic titles, integrating them into the Roman hierarchy without entirely displacing their social and ceremonial roles. Economic reorganization accompanied political control. Roman authorities standardized taxation, introduced coinage circulation throughout the province, and expanded trade networks connecting Thrace to the broader imperial economy. Agricultural production, mining, and timber extraction were increasingly directed toward imperial needs, while local markets continued to facilitate regional commerce. Epigraphic evidence demonstrates ongoing cooperation between Roman officials and Thracian elites in resource management. Military integration ensured both security and regional stability. Thracian auxiliary units were recruited into the Roman army, serving in frontier defense and campaigns throughout the empire. Local levies supplemented professional legions, demonstrating continuity in martial traditions while aligning military obligations with Roman strategic priorities. Fortifications along rivers and passes preserved earlier defensive networks, augmented by Roman engineering techniques. Cultural and social continuity persisted alongside administrative transformation. Thracian religious practices, burial customs, and elite ceremonial life continued, often within the framework of Roman civic and religious structures. Inscriptions, funerary monuments, and material culture reveal a hybridization of Roman and Thracian forms, reflecting adaptation rather than suppression. Urban development reflected Roman planning principles. Towns and settlements were reorganized with standard street grids, forums, and public buildings, facilitating administration, commerce, and civic life. Roman infrastructure, including roads and bridges, enhanced connectivity across the province, integrating Thrace into imperial networks while maintaining access to traditional regional centers. Local governance operated under imperial oversight. Former tribal leaders were incorporated into municipal roles or granted honorary positions, preserving influence while subordinated to Roman law. This co-optation minimized resistance and encouraged the participation of Thracian elites in maintaining provincial stability. By the 1st century CE, Thrace had transitioned from a fragmented tribal kingdom to a fully integrated province within the Roman Empire. Administrative standardization, military presence, and economic incorporation established durable control, while the persistence of local traditions ensured continuity of identity. Before we move on to exploring Thrace's enduring impact, make sure to hit the subscribe button, click the bell icon to catch every Nightfall history documentary, and leave a comment sharing which part of Thracian history fascinated you most. Your support helps keep these deep dives into ancient civilizations coming every day.